Today we talk about the historical Jesus. We talk about the Jesus that was crucified, that suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, dead, and buried. Today we talk about the suffered under Pontius Pilate part and the crucified part. And I want to take a little bit different perspective than what we usually do in our quest of faith. So usually we talk about the spiritual aspect of the Bible and how those things guide us in this time and place in our life. But today I want to talk about the historical Jesus. So often we forget, and so many in very powerful positions don't know that Jesus was a historical human being. It isn't uncommon for people, for non-believers, to make incredulous remarks like, I don't even know if Jesus ever lived or if he lived. Well, history tells us that he did, and that he lived in the first century, just as it is recorded in the Bible. Now, to be clear, all historians use the Bible as a historical document. Historians themselves don't question the existence of the people in the Bible. They particularly don't question the existence of the people in the New Testament. And they use the Bible to have a better and clearer understanding of the culture and the ethnicity and the place and time that first century Jews lived, as well as first century Greeks and Romans and others. The Bible is a wonderful document because it records what it was like to be a common person in the first century. The books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the book of Acts, are all historical documents. No serious historian questions that. But others might question whether those people lived or if Jesus lived, because they don't see anything recorded about him in documents other than the biblical text. But the reality is there are many recordings of Jesus outside of the Bible. The Jews have a book that they call the Talmud. And in the Talmud, it is a running record of what's going on in Judaism on that particular day and time in history. It was a book that they kept for many years before Christ, many centuries before Christ, and it is a book that they still keep today. In the Talmud, there is a recording about a warrant for Jesus's arrest. And it clearly states that an arrest warrant went out for Jesus for him to be tried and stoned to death for insurrection of the people and blasphemy. When that warrant was issued, we find an event in the book of John where Jesus has a confrontation with many of the Jews in Jerusalem, and he slips away as he does in other places. He does so in Nazareth and at other times. He slips out of their hands, and he and the 12 apostles, disciples, go and live in the Jordan wilderness, outside of the jurisdiction of Herod or the Romans or Judea. It's no man's land. It's where many people that are wanted for crimes stayed in order to avoid being arrested, tried, and executed. Word comes to Jesus that his friend Lazarus is dying, and Lazarus' sisters, Mary and Martha, send for Jesus to come and heal him, but he doesn't come. And then after Lazarus has died, Jesus comes and raises him from the dead. Now that's a wonderful biblical account with many great lessons of faith embedded into it. But today I want to look at the historical record, the Talmud, that records Jesus, who was wanted by the Jewish authorities. And this Jesus of Nazareth was wanted, as it says in the Talmud. The reason that they did not stone him is by the time the authorities got their hands on him, it was the high holy days of Passover. And so they had to find another means of execution, which they wanted carried out as quickly as possible. And they appealed to their friend Pilate, who had him crucified. Now, to be sure, there are other historians that wrote about Jesus. There's Tacitus, who was not a friend of Christians and resented Christians, who writes about the Jews in Rome and the Christians, the followers of Christus, which is what would have been written in a Roman document, who believed that Jesus had been crucified and was resurrected on the third day. And he states that this person did exist, and he speaks of later Christians in 60 AD. Jesus was crucified in 33, whom Nero blamed for the fire in Rome. What's important about what Tacitus wrote is the fact that it records that people in 60 AD, even Roman people, acknowledge the existence of Jesus and the fact that he was crucified. There's a letter from Pliny the Younger, who was the governor of Judea after Pontius Pilate, writing to Trajan, and in that letter, Pliny asks for counsel on how he deals with these people called Christians, these Christ followers. These are people that believed that Jesus was the Messiah or the Christ, and that he was crucified and rose from the dead. Pliny doesn't make any attempt to say that this didn't happen. He affirms that it happened. And that's why the document is significant. Because if the non-believers, the people that were against Christ, wrote about him as an historical figure, then one can hardly say that it didn't happen. People that don't like you people that resent your presence on the planet, they don't deny your existence, regardless of their political and spiritual persuasions about what you did. There's also a document written, there are 2 books written by Josephus, who writes about the history of the Jews during the 1st century. He wrote about Jesus 3 times. In the later books, Josephus writes from the beginning of Augustine, who was the first Caesar and came to power about 20 years before Christ, to Nero. That was the first royal family that sat at the throne of Rome. And he wrote about things that happened during that period of time. He makes a reference to Jesus when he says that his brother, James, who they called the Just, James, was executed by the Sanhedrin because James was an insurrectionist and a blasphemer, and he believed in his brother, the one they call Jesus. He also wrote in his first volume about Jesus, and that he was a wise man whom many followed and was crucified by the authorities as being an insurrectionist. So we see in these historical documents that are not Christian that Jesus was a historical person. It's important. It may seem somewhat insignificant to those of us who have strong faith and never doubt that sort of thing anyway. But let me tell you, you should tell your children these stories about this part of history, because they will encounter professors and they will encounter teachers who will make the foolish statement that Jesus never lived, or that Christians believe something that's totally false. And this is why we study the Apostles' Creed, because we not only believe, but we can back up with fact the statements in the Apostles' Creed. And because we believe them, they should have knowledge of the factual record, the historical record of Jesus and his followers. There is a plethora of historical documents that record the lives of the 12 apostles, the believers of Christ. And many of those records are kept and studied and used to establish that all of these people were witness to the man Jesus. And therefore we know that what he taught and what he said and what he did actually happened. And we can prove it even without our Bibles. This is a good thing, because the world has always pursued a message of fraud when it comes to the Christian faith. But we know better. Amen.